The United States and its role in World War II. The Great Depression in the United States led to a great worldwide depression. This depression and the effects of World War I had left the German economy in tatters. By the 1930s, a German dictator, pictured here on the left with his characteristic armband, Adolf Hitler, he took advantage of Germany's troubles, and he stirred up German nationalism. He rearmed the country, even though the Treaty of Versailles said that he could not, and he began to threaten his neighbors. For example, by 1936, German troops occupied the Rhineland, a German region on the border with France. 2 years later, in 1938, Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, be returned to Germany. Because France and Great Britain still bore the scars of World War I, they would go to great lengths to prevent another conflict. France and Britain already distrusted Hitler, yet they had decided on a policy of appeasement, yielding to an enemy's demands in order to maintain peace. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Stalin created a totalitarian dictatorship. By the 1930s, Stalin had established a totalitarian dictatorship there. He set two main economic goals for the Soviet Union. One, he wanted to raise agricultural production, and two, he wanted to modernize industry. By 1928, Stalin had established a 5-year plan to reach his goals, but Stalin used brutal methods to strengthen his control over the Communist Party, famously killing hundreds, thousands, some estimate even millions of people in work camps in Siberia, one of the harshest regions in the Soviet Union. He famously said, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is just a statistic." Here's Benito Mussolini, pictured on the left. He famously said, "Democracy is beautiful in theory, but in practice it's a fallacy. You in America will see that someday," he said. Mussolini established a fascist dictatorship in Italy. He was a veteran of the war, and he took advantage of conditions in Italy, poor conditions, to emerge as a national figure, sort of a populist figure, and eventually he formed a dictatorship there too. By 1919, he founded the first fascist political movement. But Mussolini used his extraordinary skill at public speaking, much like Hitler, to promote fascism. By 1922, fascists dominated several areas of Italy, including their economy, their politics, and their society. Which we return back to Hitler here, as he's leading the rise of Nazism in Germany. He famously said, "Make the lie big, make it simple, keep saying it, and eventually they will believe it." By 1919, Hitler, he was Germany's future leader, joined a small political party that later became known as the Nazi Party. Under his leadership, this party would direct a mass movement based on a form of fascism known as Nazism. Hitler laid out the Nazi philosophy in his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. The military took control of Japan's government by the 1930s. Here on the left you have Hideki Tojo saying, "When survival is threatened, struggles erupt between peoples, and unfortunate wars between nations result." By the 1930s, since the worldwide economic depression was undermining civilian rule in Japan, it caused Japan to move toward a policy of militarism. Being that they were a small country, they formed an extreme form of nationalism that called for Japan growing its military. Japan got a boost in 1941 to its militarism when this guy, General Hideki Tojo, became the prime minister. He replaced a civilian leader. Now, Tojo was an aggressive expansionist, and he called for the invasion of places like China. Which brings me to the United States, which remains isolated for the most part during this time because of the bitter memory of the First World War and the challenge of economic problems at home. They didn't want the nation to become entangled in another war, specifically because we were in a Great Depression at the time. During the 30s, for example, most Americans still strongly favored isolationism, and it was for this reason that President Franklin Roosevelt took no direct action against aggressive dictators in Asia and Europe. He did, however, speak out against aggression in principle. In his 1933 inaugural address, Roosevelt vowed that the United States would be a good neighbor who respects the rights of others. This pledge was meant to send a message to aggressor nations, but it also reflected his desire to end U.S. intervention in Latin America and improve relations with his neighbors. During this period, the United States did little to thwart aggression or to stop it. Congress even passed additional neutrality acts in 1936 and 1937, and they were designed to keep the country out of conflicts brewing inside of Europe and most of Asia, such as the Spanish Civil War and the Manchurian Wars in China with Japan. Americans passionately supported this isolationism. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, for example, the League of Nations considered establishing an oil embargo or a suspension of trade against Italy, but Italy's offensive would grind to a halt without oil, so the League asked other nations to stop the flow of oil to Italy, and they even called for it to Japan as well. Which brings me to the fact that the United States is sort of interested now in the war and is starting to establish itself as semi-isolationist, not fully isolationist. Because Roosevelt is slowly inching away from neutrality, by November of 1939, he pushes a bill through Congress that repealed the arms embargo. This Neutrality Act of 1939 included a cash and carry provision. After the fall of France, the United States finally began rearming itself in earnest, and Roosevelt was determined to provide Britain all aid short of war and urged Congress to adopt a plan to lend, not sell arms to Britain. This was known as the LEND-LEASE Act. By August, Churchill and Roosevelt met in secret aboard a warship in Canadian waters on the North Atlantic. There, they prepared a declaration of common principles known as the Atlantic Charter. Here they are signing it in August of 1941. But as fate would have it, by December 7th, Japan attacks the United States. From 40 to 41, Japan continued seeking raw materials through conquest around areas neighboring Japan. The United States tried to undercut its aggression in several ways, including an oil embargo. But by December 7th, Japanese aircraft carriers approached Hawaii, and from the carriers, 300 bombers and fighter planes launched an attack on Pearl Harbor. The very next day, on December 8th, Roosevelt asked famously Congress to declare war on Japan, citing that Japan attacked in a very cowardly way, and today is a day of infamy where we need to attack Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. In summary, by the 1930s, extreme nationalists gained power in Italy, Germany, and Japan, which became known as the Axis powers. They sought to expand through military conquest, and these countries began World War II. By 1941, the U.S. entered the war as one of the Allied powers. Totalitarianism. You need to know what this term means, and it means basically that there were several people like Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler who rose to power and restored faith in the governments of their respective nations, but they built up militaries and they began campaigns of expansion, and they were imitated by people like Benito Mussolini and Hideki Tojo in Italy and Japan. You also need to know what the Munich Pact means. This is the time when Great Britain and France tried to appease Hitler, and in the Munich Pact they agreed to give him part of Czechoslovakia in return for peace. But Hitler continued with his expansion even though that pact was made, and invaded Poland by 1939, triggering the start of World War II in Europe. These neutrality acts are something else that's important for you to understand, because in the 30s they kept the U.S. from being drawn into European conflicts, including this thing called the Spanish Civil War. As World War II begins, however, Franklin Roosevelt and the Congress revised the acts to allow arms trading with the Allies. Which brings me to the LEND-LEASE Act, in which Germany quickly occupied most of Europe and threatened to invade Great Britain. As German bombers ravaged the British cities in the Blitzkrieg, the United States decided to help Britain by passing the LEND-LEASE Act. This law allowed the U.S. to lend arms to Britain and later to the Soviet Union. By December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and this attack caused the United States to declare war on Japan and enter World War II. Be sure to answer the following exit ticket in a well-written paragraph on your own sheet of paper.